Bits and bytes from the high-tech world with Peter Griffin, and this week, driverless cars here in New Zealand. With autonomous vehicles coming to our roads in the not-too-distant future, how ready are we for this technology? It's a question with major implications, not just for road users, whether you're a driver, truckie, cyclist or pedestrian, but also for our police, parking wardens, councils and the people planning and designing our towns and cities. Michael Cameron is the author of a study funded by the Law Foundation investigating the need for legal reforms to cope with driverless vehicles in New Zealand. As part of his research, Michael spent time in the US, Europe, Singapore and Australia reviewing international laws and visiting some of the big players designing driverless cars, which have been in the news quite a bit recently.
All tests of self-driving cars have been suspended by Uber after a female pedestrian was killed in Arizona.
This dashcam video shows the horrifying seconds before a self-driving Uber hit and killed a pedestrian.
This is the second time, actually, this has happened. This happened back in May. There was a similar incident for Uber's autonomous car testing.
Uber has suspended its self-driving car program after one of its autonomous SUVs struck and killed a woman in Arizona.
So, Michael, what do you make of this latest accident that's happened with an Uber vehicle?
Well, the important thing to realise with that Uber crash, which was a great tragedy, but that was not technically a driverless vehicle because it did have a driver. It had a supervising driver. Uber has recognised that its technology was not ready to be let loose, to operate on its own. And so that means that that accident was an accident that a human could make because a human did make it. In that instance.
But the human, and I've seen the footage, the chap who was meant to be the next layer in terms of safety was not looking at the road.
Absolutely, was not really paying attention.
And the outward footage that I saw of the cyclist, the woman pushing her bicycle, it was fairly obvious to me,
yes.
Even looking at a pretty crappy screen with low streaming rates, that there was a human there.
It was quite concerning, that video. I actually went to Pittsburgh and had a ride in one of those Uber vehicles.
This is the Volvo with the LiDAR network, so this is LiDAR technology.
Yes.
What is LiDAR, just briefly?
LiDAR's like radar, but it uses lasers and it shoots out lasers in different directions. You actually see them in the streets around Silicon Valley and in San Francisco and in Pittsburgh, and they've got this spinning disc on the top of them, which is shooting out the laser, and it builds a 3D map of the area. So yes, and when I was in the Uber vehicle in Pittsburgh, there is a screen which shows you what the computer is seeing, so which is a digital image made up of its memory of what's been mapped before, plus overlaying, live pictures of the people, which is built up by the lasers. And I was looking at the window, I could see a person there looking at the screen, I could see the person on the screen made up of dots from the LiDAR, so that was quite impressive. So it is a bit of a mystery as to why the LiDAR did not pick that up, and it just shows you, before the technology can be let on the road, without supervising drivers, we need to be ready for it.
Just on the technology, Michael, so from your trip to Silicon Valley, looking at Uber and Waymo and these sorts of companies, what are the big barriers that are remaining to allowing this mass adoption? We've got the legal issues we're going to talk about, but are there any technical challenges they still have to sort out?
Waymo, the Google subsidiary, are claiming essentially to have cracked autonomy, at least within a limited domain. The main barriers is that a lot of work still has to be done, as I understand it. The area that it operates in would be very constrained. You couldn't just take one of these Waymo vehicles from Arizona, where it's operating, and transplant it to New Zealand, because it's got to be operating within a area that's been fully mapped, and also that the vehicle has been essentially practicing within. And so I think that the biggest barrier is mapping the areas.
And they've racked up millions of hours of driving time, right, with relatively few accidents. And a lot of the accidents that have happened with autonomous vehicles have actually been human error, other people driving into them. So there's enough evidence to suggest that this is going to be a safer way to approach transport.
It's interesting how much we can read into that, because if you've despite what you saw with that Uber vehicle, that they are very, very conservative drivers. That's part of the reason why they wouldn't have had that many accidents. And they're required, at least in California, to publish the accident or disengagement reports, as they call them, which is any time when the vehicle goes, I don't know what's happening, and hands over to the driver. So we as the public can't really tell much from that, and that is an essential question: is how can you tell how safe they are? Because you could give them a driving test like you give a human, but a human is a product of 4 billion years worth of evolution, and we know that it doesn't really have any. Most people don't really have any major blind spots in terms of their thinking or their. But a vehicle could ace the driving test, but that could be a kind of a fluke, or there could be huge gaps. So they need to do so much testing, and simulation testing, and they have been doing that. But that's a very technical area, and that's the difficulty, because there's not many people who are qualified to know whether Google or Waymo are correct when they're saying that their technology is safe.
Yeah, it's all self-reported. How, as you say, how do you create sort of a standard for safety testing in this high-tech world where you're taking the human out of it? And as you say, you could ace a driving test because you can learn and you can use AI and you can feed all the data in and feed all the variables in, but as we know, the real world is different. But I'm interested from what you've said there, so you have the mapping of environments and terrains, which we'll becomes sort of cached. It's stored data based on a territory. That might be the road, the hill, where there's, when the school chucks out. All of this data, this intelligence, is one part of the technical system. But then you've got that real time, actually, hold on, this is a child, or this is a car, or I need to brake, or it's raining, or it's a plastic bag. And so that's a whole nother set of calculations and a whole nother set of data that has to be analysed. You can see the complexity here.
It's very complex. I'm actually a fan of the system they've currently got in the US, which is, there's an expectation that vehicle manufacturers will produce a safety assessment of their vehicles, and they've set out a detailed list of questions that the manufacturer must answer, and this is before a truly driverless vehicle can be allowed on the road. And if the regulators have any concerns about that, then they can it's a back-end regulation system. If they have any concerns about it, they've got quite strong regulatory action they can take. And we have actually seen that in action in the US. There was quite a alarming but interesting case where a startup company, it was called Comma AI, they sold some software and a few little gizmos you could attach to your phone, and then you'd plug that into your phone, stick it on your rear vision mirror with the camera pointing forward, plug it into your vehicle somewhere, and turn your car into a self-driving car.
Wow.
Which is actually quite genius, but obviously quite concerning as well. And the National Highway Transport Safety Authorities, they sent a letter to Comma AI, and it was like, these are all the questions you need to answer to satisfy us as to the safety of your product, and this is how much money you have to pay every day, $150,000 or something, if you don't answer the questions. And Comma AI just backed off.
So when it comes to the law, which you've specifically been looking at, the legal aspects of this, how fit for purpose are the laws in the US? I guess it's by state, is it? California will have maybe different laws to New York State. But have they been tweaking the law to accommodate the advent of driverless vehicles, or do they have a lot of work to do? Well,
states have been doing lots of different things. The interesting thing about the US, historically, there's been, at a federal level, the feds regulate the construction of the vehicle, and then the individual states are responsible for regulating the behaviour of drivers. So obviously there's a slight bit of a territory dispute when it's a self-driving car, because is that a federal jurisdiction issue, or is that a state? The federal authorities have said that they've said, we think this is our issue, and we don't want states to make laws about self-driving vehicles. We should do it. And there's the federal motor vehicle safety standards which do that. So that's how that works. And some states, like Arizona, have said, yep, we totally agree with you, the federal government, so we're not going to have any laws about it. And that's up to the federal government, that's why there's a lot of testing going on in Arizona.
And what's at the core of the legal debate here? Is it surely in a country like America, it's about liability. It's going to, when something happens, who is to blame?
Yeah, that's a key. That's an area which is quite vexed. So how vehicles get onto the road in the first place is a very complicated issue, and when once they're on there, who is going to pay for the damage if something goes wrong? And also, if there's a criminal offence committed, which could be quite a minor one, it could be a speeding one, or even just a parking offence, or it could be something quite serious, then who is liable? In America, I think it'll just come down to the law of the tort, negligence. If in product liability, it's actually not, on one level, it's not that new. If someone makes a product and says this car can drive on the road safely and it doesn't and causes damage, well, that's arguably negligence and the person can claim. And I think the same would happen in New Zealand, in fact, at least for property damage with personal injury. ACC puts New Zealand in a special case, but with property damage, that would be the case. And the one interesting thing about New Zealand is if a manufacturer's vehicle crashes and misbehaves and causes damage, if the manufacturer is to be held liable for that in a civil action, the court will have to conclude that they were negligent, which I'm actually not sure if that's accurate to court, because some of these vehicles may crash at, if they could be very good, they could crash at 1% of the rate of a human. This could be a marvel of human engineering, this vehicle, and to call the act of constructing that vehicle a negligent act, I don't really think that is negligent, because it's not infallible. So that's why I still think manufacturers should pay for the damage, but I think it's not fair to call them negligent. I think we need to have a product liability regime where they are just liable if their car does anything where a human would have been liable if it had been driving.
So you have in the book, I think you've got 8 recommendations there about changes to the law here to prepare us for driverless cars coming to New Zealand. How would you characterise them? Is this a major overhaul you're proposing here? Is this tweaks of the existing legislation?
I think we do have to have a major overhaul at some point, but I've concentrated on essentially tweaks. I mean, some of the tweaks are quite complicated, but tweaks that we can do more quickly. And some of those tweaks I think we have to do soon. Like, for example, I think we need, and this is quite a simple one, but to have a positive statement in the Land Transport Act that driverless vehicles are legal and vehicles don't have to have a driver. There's nothing in our law which positively states that they do have to have a driver, but there's nothing the other way either. And I think it's very likely that the law doesn't require a driver in New Zealand, but why not make that absolutely clear, if for nothing else, to send a signal to people, New Zealand companies, overseas companies who are looking where to invest. We've got a great company in New Zealand who's developing driverless shuttles. I'm sure it would be good for them to have for the investment.
Something overt, because your average traffic cop today, if he saw my, old dunger going down the road with no one in it, he'd probably drop his coffee and stick his siren on and chase it, thinking, "Oh, what's going on?" I mean, we're not, I guess that we're not. That wouldn't be very acceptable to the existing regime or the existing legal framework.
Yes, it would be interesting. I mean, at the other end of the spectrum, if that driverless vehicle was to speed at like 200 kilometres an hour, and the cop tried to pull it over and not sure what it would do, and who would you charge? Who would you charge with the speeding offence? Because there's no driver, and actually the offence of speeding in New Zealand, this is what it says. It says, no driver shall drive a vehicle faster than the speed limit. That offence has not been committed, really, if there's no driver, which means essentially that driverless vehicles can speed with impunity under the law. And I'm not sure if that's what we want.
So the risk here is that New Zealand, we're not prepared for this technology, and you have been overseas, and it's nearly ready to go. I mean, we're talking how far away is it realistically for New Zealand to have autonomous driverless vehicles? Could we do it today? Is the tech ready?
It's really in our own hands, and how organised can we be in terms of getting driverless vehicles on our roads? I mean, as I've just mentioned, they've essentially been invented already. So the only thing, the main thing holding them back, well, there's a lot of work to do in mapping, but why would anyone invest in the mapping in New Zealand if they're not sure if it can be legally done in New Zealand? So if you ask me when can it happen, well, how fast do we want it to happen? How determined are we as a country to create a receptive legal environment for those vehicles? The technology is invented already.
But there are other implications as well, which you outline in the book, around urban planning, infrastructure, even how parking buildings are designed and the regulation around them. Because if you have a parking building where people aren't actually going to go into, it's just going to be driverless cars parking for a while until they go and pick someone else up. Because these cars potentially could be on the road all day, not just picking up you, but maybe your kids taking them to school. and then hiring it out to other people during the day while you're at work. So there's all sorts of other changes that are going to have to happen from an infrastructure point of view, from urban planning to accommodate these.
Yes, that's right. They're more medium to long-term things, but so we don't need to do them right now. But yeah, they're very important. I mean, driverless vehicles hopefully are going to be great, but they could also be a nightmare. We're hoping that they will decrease congestion, but they could just as easily increase congestion a lot. I mean, if vehicles are, if they're going to be as convenient and cheap as we're hoping, well then people will take many more rides than they used to. So we need to make sure our laws are structured to encourage, ride sharing, to encourage and so that dedicated parking buildings for driverless vehicles only can be built, and that our authorities have the powers that they need to, if they want, encourage people to still walk places, because a lot of the character of cities is people walking around the place, and if everyone's just swooping past everything and pinpoint delivery to their driverless vehicle, well, that's going to not be very good for a lot of cities.
And what's the legal status? We do have semi-autonomous vehicles in New Zealand now. We've got the Tesla Model S, for instance. You go on the highway and you can take your hands off the wheel. Is that totally legal?
Yes, because it's really just an evolution of
cruise control.
Yeah, it's sort of cruise control.
Things we've had for a long time. Cruise control is pretty primitive, but it's been around for like 50 years or more. But the car's partly driving itself, but there has to be a supervising driver. It's the same thing with Tesla. Obviously, it's a lot more of a concern, because the more the car does, the more likely the person is to switch off, as we've seen at least a couple of times with Tesla vehicles. And other manufacturers, they've said, we want to skip the semi-autonomous phase. That's just too dangerous. We want to go straight to the fully autonomous stage where the human has no responsibility. So that's Waymo's objective. But there's good arguments to say, no, the semi-autonomous stage, whilst it has its problems, is still good, because Tesla vehicles actually crash when they introduced their autopilot technology. For all the concerns about people not paying attention, their crash rate went down. So it seems like that was made up for. But the status of semi-autonomous vehicles on the road in New Zealand is the same as any other vehicle.
Michael, what would be the driver here, though, for this legal change? What is a government's going to have to spend time and go through the process of changing transport laws here and other laws potentially? Is it about safety? Is it about economics? Is it about environmental footprints? What is the main sell for this technology today?
We could eliminate traffic accidents. We could, end traffic congestion if we do it right. And we could spark economic growth for New Zealand. And, on that last point, some people might scoff that New Zealand can be a leader in autonomous vehicle technology, but I'd say, we've shown in recent times, New Zealand has shown that with Rocket Lab in the North Island, and with the construction of the the development of the autonomous flying taxi in Christchurch, the Kitty Hawk, that we can participate in the development of world-beating technology. So there's no reason why that can't happen with driverless vehicles, and it is happening a bit. But if we really want it to happen, then we need a receptive legal environment. So that's why government should act. And and it could be quite a big missed opportunity if we don't. And it's not just driverless vehicles. There is apparently a coming wave of automation, and driverless vehicles are the ground floor. And it's going to be good in many ways, all these robots, but a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, and there'll be a lot of winners and losers, and a lot of countries that are winners and countries that are losers. And at least if New Zealand can be developed, it can be participating in the development of the technology, we're more prosperous, and we can help the losers within our country.
That's a good point. I just read in China there are 16 million truck drivers. So imagine when they have these so-called ghost fleets of trucks, autonomous trucks, and Tesla and others have built these trucks going all over China, all over the US, all over New Zealand, delivering logs and groceries, totally autonomous. That's potentially a lot of jobs there.
Well, 40,000, I think is the figure, I'd have to check, but I think 40,000 people in New Zealand make a living as a driver, so That's a lot of jobs.
Hey, finally, Michael, we haven't mentioned ethics, and we've heard a lot about scenarios where you've got an autonomous vehicle or a driverless car, and you've got, say, a balding sort of radio presenter in the late part of his career crossing the road. Then you've got a young, intelligent student. And
if they're a law student or a lawyer, you run them, get one over.
But the car essentially has to, it's a crash scene is underway, and it has to work out, who do I hit? It's going to hit someone because there are people around, and the ethics of how a decision is made about what to do and how technology is cognizant of, I guess, ethical issues. How's that going to play out?
Yeah, well, people love this topic, and there's the whole field of trolleyology, which was invented before driverless vehicles.
Trolleyology? Yeah,
that was to test what people think about different ethical decisions, and this scenario was made up. There's this trolley going down a track, and you're standing next to one of those levers which can divert it onto another track, and if you do nothing, the trolley will carry on and wipe out 5 people on the track. Or you can put the lever and divert it onto another track and kill 1 person. So what would you do? And most people switch the lever, and then you can tweak the scenario, and so it's kind of tailor-made for these questions about driverless vehicles, because it's a little bit like that for real life with driverless vehicles. And people are saying, well, how are you? They're validly asking manufacturers, how are you programming your vehicles? What are you going to get them to do? And I love talking about that too. And there's quite a convincing case to say that the government should actually regulate, is to require the vehicle to choose the minimum harm option in all cases. So, for example, if it's trying to decide between option A, which would kill the driver, or option B, which would kill 3 pedestrians, it should kill the driver. And actually everyone should want that. Obviously not that particular driver, but everyone in society should want the government to regulate for that, because that will apply to everyone. So you could be, on another day, you could be one of the pedestrians. So in terms of your personal survival and that of your loved ones, it's better if the government regulates to make cars do the minimum harm option. That's a very convincing argument. But I actually think really it's beside the point, because driverless vehicles, except maybe in very rare cases, all they'll be doing is slamming on their brakes. The universal evasive strategy for a car is to slam on the brakes. In fact, the car won't know enough to know, option B will be this % chance of that person dying. They won't have all that information, and really they should be driving in a defensive manner, so that the most effective strategy for them is to just slam on the brakes.
Has anyone thought about external airbags? I mean, a bit lateral thinking here, but I mean, you hit the road, and this whole thing blows up. It's like a bouncy castle hitting you.
Well, at 100 kilometres an hour.
Actually, I do know. No, it's not stupid. There are actually standards for the construction of regular vehicles about. It matters a lot to pedestrians where the engine is, how close is it to the bonnet. Because if the bonnet crumples, that's good for the pedestrian. But if it crumples into some pointy bit of the engine, that's not good. So I don't know. There might be airbags, but there's different ways you can make cars which are good for that.
That's your next startup.
And then that's actually a good point, because it's actually not a new issue. Manufacturers having to make choices about how to value the lives of the people in the car, of the people outside of the car, is not a new thing. As Bart Simpson retorted to his sister when she was concerned about the crash rate of the fatality rate of SUVs, and they're about to get into an SUV. Bart Simpson goes, fatal to the people in the other vehicle. Let's roll.
Thanks, Peter. Peter Griffin, and a big thanks to Michael Cameron, who was the Law Foundation's International Research Fellow in 2016, and you can find a link to his report called Realising the Potential of Driverless Vehicles for New Zealand. It's on our website right now. And just remind you, our email address, bits@radionz.co.nz. If you'd like us to look into anything, drop us a line.